Um, Hopefully he'll hear it when he comes on. It is my honor to introduce Brian Ferguson, a remarkable individual whose diverse experiences have uniquely positioned him as a leader in the realms of high performance medicine and human potential. With a background enriched by encounters with leaders and decision makers in the U.S. national security, the military, and the technology, Brian has channeled his insights into the establishment of Arena Labs, a pioneering company in the field of high-performance medicine. At Arena Labs, Brian and his teams are embarking on a transformative mission to redefine healthcare. Their vision involves treating doctors and nurses as elite performers by equipping them with the same training tools and technologies harnessed by the elite military personnel, Olympic athletes, and creative masters. By doing so, they aim to combat burnout within healthcare institutions and empower healthcare teams to thrive amidst the rigors of their demanding and often stressful careers. Beyond his work at Arena Labs, Brian is a partner and co-founder of the Liminal Collective, an extraordinary company with a profound focus on enhancing human performance and enabling audacious endeavors. The Liminal Collective's current initiatives span diverse frontiers, including civilian space travel, deep sea exploration, and the digital evolution of cyberspace. Brian's journey also encompasses a distinguished military career as a Navy SEAL officer with deployments in Afghanistan and various regions of the Middle East. Before donning the uniform, he served as a presidential appointee in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and worked within the White House. In the academic sphere, Brian imparts his knowledge as a faculty member at Singularity University in Silicon Valley, collaborating with Fortune 500 leaders to address challenges associated with exponential technology and transformative change. Moreover, he co-chairs the Limits of Human Performance Symposium at the Santa Fe Institute on Complexity and is a valued member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Brian holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics and possesses proficiency in intermediate Parisian and Farsi language. Committed to making a difference in the world, Brian serves as on the boards of Adler, C-Trek, and the Honor Foundation. Despite his extensive accomplishments, he takes immense pride in his role as a father to his daughter, Winnin Valentine. He currently resides in Nashville, Tennessee, and continues to be a beacon of inspiration and innovation in various fields. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up.
You're not hearing anything coming through at the moment, Brian.
And can you hear me?
I'll test my speakers as well.
Yeah.
Try again.
Can you hear me now?
You're booming.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much. Number one, forgive the that's a painful bio, and Robbie, thank you for making me sound way more fascinating. But I just want to, I guess all of you in medicine know the unfortunate reality of my life now. I suppose if I was just to make that bio very simple, I deeply love getting to work with service archetypes and people who are committed to making the world better. I've been humbled to be around those people. The reality of medicine is that landscapes and schedules changed dramatically. We're doing research right now in New York City that's very important for our mission. And the short version, I just hate making schedules change and people wait. And I offer my sincere apologies for the challenges on scheduling this morning. Actually, a teammate of mine, Ryan Karen, was scheduled to do this and wanted to, and ended up, he's being treated for a medical illness. And bottom line, I'm grateful I can be here virtually and that Robbie allowed that. But there's a number of people in the audience today who have been amazing thought partners in this idea of high performance medicine and how do we help people learn at a higher level. So I want to go through that narrative this morning. I guess just to be clear, for Robbie and Nikolai and the team, Kristen, how much time? I know that you all have a tight agenda, so I would like to offer some provocative thoughts, but I want to be sensitive to what I know is a schedule I've already disrupted.
10 o'clock.
Okay. So what I'd like to do this morning is challenge, maybe put, given in the spirit of simulation and learning, I'd like to offer humbly some of the things that I've learned along the way. And to be clear, I don't consider myself an expert on anything, but my prior life in national security and in the SEAL teams, I've been around a lot of simulation, a lot of advanced training, and thinking about this question of, in an evolving world technologically, how do we still challenge our teams in a way that makes sense for the reality of our resources and the reality, I think, in medicine of time. And so I'd love to just share some thoughts and then have a discussion. I know that it's not as fresh when you're not in person. But I do hope that, I know there's microphones in front of all of you that you know, at any point along the way you want to stop me. But I'd love to have a more rigorous discussion around some of the things that are on your minds. So let me dive into this concept. I personally love this idea of the teams of tomorrow and how do we build world-class teams. Nikolai, you don't mind, can you see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to move through this reasonably quickly. If anyone has at some point you want to stop me, or there's something that a provocative thought or statement you want to dig in, I'd love that. But I want to be conscious here of maybe a good 20 minutes of content and then move into a discussion. I will tell you, again, that sort of very long, biography. The early part of my life when I was in national security in the Pentagon and the White House, this is right after 9/11. I'll tell you, my biggest takeaway was that large institutional architectures, whether we're talking about government, the military, or healthcare, are struggling with speed of change in the 21st century as it relates to technology and delivering better experiences to the human system. And I often say what 9/11 was to the military industrial complex is very similar to what COVID has been to healthcare. These problems existed well before COVID, but they have just elevated and put more stress on the human system. And you as leaders and people thinking about delivering better training and simulation are now sort of caught between the trade-off of more technology that's expensive and a human system that doesn't have time but feels stressed. And so I want to dig into that and this idea of how do we build high-performing medical teams in the digital age. One of the things that I think is so important is what we at Arena call the sacred world of medicine. All of you, whether you are practitioners on the front lines of healthcare or serving practitioners, are service archetypes. Service archetypes are paramount in a flourishing society. And I think that medicine is different. It's just like military and educators. You are serving a role in society that is sacred. And we don't often stop to really think about that. If someone, I would love it if anyone has a mic in front of them and has seen this before, if you wouldn't mind indulging the audience and sharing just a quick thought on what this photo is, if you've seen this. This is one of my favorite photographs, but I want to start here. Any takers? And this is where if I was live, I would be able to maybe cold call. Has anybody seen this before?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Bad time to wave.
Oh, that was a wave? The pump fake?
Anybody else?
No?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
I believe this was the first successful cardiac transplant.
You nailed it. Do you know where?
I don't remember. I'm sorry,
Okay.
but I know the
No,
doctor
thank
stayed
you.
at the bedside.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Most very rarely does someone know the story behind it. But this, in the spirit of everything we're going to talk about today, I think is such an important starting point. So this is the 1987 National Geographic Photo of the Year, and this was the first cardiac transplant ever performed in the Eastern Bloc of Europe. It was done in Poland in 1987. The gentleman on the left, Dr. Religa, was trained in the West. He trained at Harvard, went back to his home country of Poland, and was passionate about advancing healthcare in his home country. At the time, it was sacrosanct to take a human heart from one person and put it in another, and the Catholic Church had a strong role in Poland. So he had to go to the black market to get funding to do this procedure. It took 23 hours. And if you look in the back right-hand corner, you see his fellow collapsed in exhaustion. And it's such a powerful visual. And if you look at Dr. Religa, if you look from his shoulders down, it's just pure exhaustion in his body. But if you look at his eyes, it's like he's willing that patient alive. This patient actually went on to outlive Dr. Religa. But the thing that is so important as a starting point when we're talking about whether, we're talking about simulation and training, the world of medicine is different because service archetypes are people who have an inspired soul that allows us to transcend what we're capable of. That is a beautiful thing. The challenge is that when we don't have the right tools and architecture over place, we will give of ourselves and give of ourselves against the better angels of our nature until there's nothing left to give. And so that is a sacred responsibility as leaders and building teams to say, what is the balance between service and of understanding how to give people the right tools and training to protect against those better angels? Now, for me, that journey and the journey alongside many of you today very humbly began this little skinny guy who could use a meal. Is me sometime in the mid-90s in Cleveland, Ohio, at a hospital called Lakewood Hospital that was later acquired by the Cleveland Clinic. I was here shadowing an orthopedic surgeon because I wanted to join your ranks in healthcare. And the reason for that is this woman on the left. That's my mother. I make a lot of jokes about my dad's pleather coat. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and in the hipster community that would go for like $2,000. This photo was taken, I think, in 1974. But if you look at my mom just beaming, I just still love this photo every time I see it because that is the inspired soul. My mom felt a calling as a service archetype in healthcare. And the photo on the right is literally and figuratively my family dining room table. And so I have memories as a kid of being fascinated that my mom loved something outside the house I didn't fully understand. But on the rare occasions she lost a patient or something went wrong in the operating room, you could viscerally feel that at the kitchen table. And so I want to come back to that concept of carrying what we love home and thinking about it without the right tools and training. It leaves a real residue on us. Now, I learned about that residue because rather than going into medicine, I had the privilege, as Robbie mentioned, of going into the military and serving as a Navy SEAL. The first thing you have to learn as a SEAL is what am I afraid of and how do I manage fear and anxiety? And in simulation and training along the way, one is expected to understand how to move those tools in the face of anxiety and fear to still perform under pressure. I was 30 years old when I finished training, but it fundamentally changed my life. Now, my last job in special operations was in undersea clandestine special operations. So working underwater in these mini submersibles. And we were trying to understand in this environment underwater where special operators might be in the dark for 8 to 12 hours with no food and no hydration, how do we work with the best teams in the world to advance training and use simulation and simulated training to operate in this very high stakes environment? So in the course of that, I got to work with some of the coolest organizations in the world. I was waking people up with a little bit of Cirque du Soleil, but when you think about creative artists and performers who have to perform on stage every night, it's a really powerful concept to understand how do I take care of myself so that I can be present in a high stakes environment. In the world of elite sport, got to work with Nike in their innovation lab as they were at the time trying to see if a man could break a 2-hour marathon record. For those of you who are runners, running a marathon in 2 hours means that you run at a pace of 13.2 miles per hour for 26 miles. It's absolute insanity. But just in the spirit of inspiration this morning and thinking about how simulation and training advances the human spirit, we'll take a second to watch this video.
Now, through hard work and discipline, he's pointing. Come on, he says. Eliud Kipchoge has the hand of history on his shoulder. He has less than 200 meters to go. Eliud Kipchoge, let's keep an eye on the clock. Into the final 20 seconds. Eliud Kipchoge on his shoulder. 140, 140. The unofficial. Is his wife?
I just love that. In a minute, I'm going to come back to this idea of simulation and that particular element. And then lastly, this was the first skydive from space. Felix Baumgartner did a jump from the stratosphere back to Earth. A lot we learned about how we train someone and simulate on Earth. The experience of jumping out of a capsule from the stratosphere, becoming the first human to break the sound barrier at Mach 1.25 in free fall for 4 minutes and 25 seconds. Just insanity. But I ended up in your ranks, and I ended up going to the Cleveland Clinic Heart and Vascular Institute. At the time, special operations is very similar to the operating theater, a team of 8 to 12 people, time-compressed environment. And what fascinated me was just how similar it is, that you all, the challenges you're thinking about in terms of, particularly in the greater Philly area, about simulation in these institutions, you've got small teams that are highly interdependent, deeply mission-driven in that service archetype, increasingly complex and dynamic because of technology in the operating theater and, in clinical spaces. But ultimately, the problem you're trying to solve is one that is high consequence, no fail. Something that is high consequence, no fail, the subtlety or the subtext of that is there is pressure and stress. And what fascinated me was all of these other cultures in sport, the creative arts, and the military were focused not just on the technical skill, but how do we teach people to perform under pressure in a high stakes, no fail environment when it counts? And so in doing that, there's this major emphasis in these high risk fields on three things: on data for self-awareness, right? Most of us have become disconnected from our own sense of interoception. How stressed am I? How anxious am I? In fact, in medicine, we're taught to often compartment or detach from that emotion. And then what tools do I need personally? What does Brian need versus one of you in the audience to manage stress? And then how do I get smart about what my body needs to recover and regenerate? And so in special operations, in the creative arts, and places like Cirque, and in elite and professional sport, there's an emphasis on these three buckets. But what fascinated me in the world, not just of the operating room, but in most parts of medical school and nursing school, there was no focus on these three things, on this idea of performing under pressure. And our question, the basic of sort of provocative question we ask at Arena Labs in the spirit of high performance medicine is, what if we gave all of you and your teams the same tools, training, and technology as elite athletes, as creative performers, and as of elite military personnel? And so where I want to go today and then open up for questions is, what do we know about these other cultures that are best in world about the future of performance? All the things I just walk you through, someone running a marathon in 2 hours, jumping from space back to Earth, performing extraordinary feats each night in this sort of creative expression at the edges of the physical body. What might we learn about that in terms of simulation and healthcare? And so where I want to go, whatever one thinks about drones, right? The first time a drone was used in the military space was 2001. Now, drones made the battlefield safer. And again, there are a lot of geopolitical conversations and very valid conversations about the use of drones that are contentious. But what was fascinating about drones and this idea of precision, just like precision in medicine, technology allows us to be more precise in our goal. But to do that, we had to go here. And does anyone in the audience know what this photo is? Any takers want to grab a microphone if that's possible? I don't know how hard it is to grab the mic.
Anybody?
Put my hand again.
He said it's a drone driver.
Yeah, this is a drone pilot. And here's what's fascinating, and this is going to be really important for our discussion today about simulation. So this gentleman is flying a drone, and that drone might be within 100 miles of him. That drone could be on the other side of the world. Technology allowed us to take a pilot from having to simultaneously be inside technology to now being able to be remote and asynchronous. So you all, that's not surprising to you. Here's what's really important to think about. In order for this pilot to know what to do, he is often listening to a team of people on the ground. Now, this could be for imagery, it could be for intelligence, but these people on the ground now have to use, you see that small interface that the soldier in the back is looking at. That interface is giving a sense of the broader picture on the ground that he is trying to understand and triangulate the drone against, right? So this actually becomes a very complex interplay of communications. Interestingly, this is the F-35 aircraft. This is now, depending on what, there's sort of famously, many of you may have seen in South Carolina 3 weeks ago, one of these got lost because the aircraft, I shouldn't say lost, but it got lost for a few hours. A pilot had to eject. The technology in these aircraft and the automation on it is so advanced, right? These things are, they market cap about $500 million, but wildly advanced in terms of their ability to fly. You think about things like stealth technology, being clandestine. The pilots have to get outfitted for a helmet. It takes 3 days to outfit the pilot for this helmet. This helmet runs about $400,000. And the reason is, and pilots have to have a special haircut. Their hair can't be too long. They have to keep this uniquely fitted to their head because it allows, there are 6 different cameras that allows the pilot to see under the aircraft. It allows the pilot to see the vantage point of their wingmen and wingwomen. But here's what's really fascinating. This helmet, despite how advanced it is, a friend of mine who's an F-35 test pilot, when they first put that aircraft in the air, because this is also allowing the individual pilot to see things like augmented reality and to simulate what's happening on the ground through visual and artificial technology, The very first time a pilot flew the F-35 aircraft, they had to ground it because of cognitive overload. We've learned that there's a limit to technology, even the most advanced technologies in the world, when we have a human in the loop. And so that's a really important foundation in our conversation. Anybody in the room who's an F1 fan want to take a guess at what the fastest recorded pit stop is? And remember, for those who are not fans, a pit stop changes 4 tires on an automobile, which to me feels like it should be 20 minutes. But anybody want to guess at what the record for a pit stop is? 4 tires in the middle of an F1 race? Any wild guesses?
Less than 10 seconds.
Less than 10 seconds. Solid.
Really? Wow.
7.5.
7.5. All right. So don't blink.
Oh my.
1.9. Absolute insanity, right? And the reason for that is, again, we've got humans in the loop, we've got advanced technology, and we have a ton of data that we're using to know when is the best time to stop based on weather conditions, based on racing conditions, other drivers. But we have had to change the way we communicate in these environments. And so the conversation I want to have today on this idea of teams of tomorrow is that robots and advanced technology, whatever sort of the sexy terminology, ChatGPT, is it AI, is it augmented reality, virtual reality? When we talk about simulation, we've got a wide spectrum of technology. But here's the thing, all of that technology has radically changed or forced an evolution in 3 really important things that I think are foundational deciding on how we think about simulation. The first is communication, how the human system communicates with each other and with technology. The second is training. How do we train smartly? And then third is we still have to understand the human system, especially the limits and cognitive load of the humans we are training. And so the question that I want to explore is, what are the implications when we're talking about this idea of a consortium of people struggling with simulation in medicine? How do we think about robotics and advanced technology in the future of healthcare? And where I want to start is this analog. I want to use this framework for our discussion today. And this is Dr. Sam Balke. He's a cardiac surgeon we're also doing research with today. I'm in New York City at the Hospital for Special Surgery. We spent a lot of time with Dr. Balke at Chicago. He is very interesting because in the early part of his career, he is what I am going to call a traditional cardiac surgeon. So he was doing traditional open heart surgery, sternotomies, and then going in and, stopping the heart using bypass and then putting that patient back together, sort of in my own parlance. He then transitioned over to become a robotic heart surgeon. He is now, by every measure, the most successful robotic surgeon the United States has ever seen. And he has a very strong philosophy that I want to get into about what has allowed him to be successful. But here's what's interesting. So let's take the traditional operating room. This doesn't have to be cardiac surgery. This can be ortho, neuro, you name it. This can actually be a trauma intake. In that environment, right? Ignore the right. Let's just think about 3 elements. One, we've got a team that is centrally located. We have bright overhead lights so that we can see inside the surgical field. Execution is based on a known communication structure that is often point to point. There's a lot of noise because people are talking over each other. And that communication it often lacks context, because if I step out of the room for a minute and come back in and I miss something, I need to be inside that sort of locus of control to understand what's happening. Now, here is Dr. Balke's robotic OR. Now, I suspect that most of you have seen the Da Vinci robot in a robotic procedure. Forgive me if this is, I of course know you're all experts, but just to set the playing field for those who have not, what you're going to see is his physician's assistant, Mackenzie, on the left side of the screen. She is on a Bluetooth headset, and she is speaking to Dr. Balke on the other side of the room and the other teammates who are on the periphery about what she's seeing on those monitors. There are 4 small, I believe, 3mm incisions placed in the chest. There's no sternotomy, so the chest is not cut open. And those 4 robotic arms you see on the left, you're going to see moving. Those are being moved by Dr. Balke on the other side of the room. And again, there is now this very different environment that I just want to observe for a minute. Now we're going to pan. And we see Dr. Balke there actually doing heart surgery. So this is a super important thing that I think to take into consideration about technology and what's changing. So in that environment, we've moved from a centralized locus of control to one that's distributed. The environment, if you notice, was dimly lit so that Dr. Balke can see inside the console in order to have a higher degree of fidelity and clarity. The team is dispersed across the room. They are oriented. Everyone is looking at screens, and the communication, what's really important is they use a Bluetooth headset so that only one person can speak at a time, and everybody knows what's being said no matter where they're at in the room. So everyone is on the same page. Here's what starts to happen. I want to use this idea of open surgery versus robot assisted surgery as an analog to begin thinking about how we train. So leadership in that room has changed, right? We've gone from a hierarchical style of leadership to one that is collaborative. Dr. Balke cannot yell or try to talk over people. He has to describe what he's seeing and give directions while bringing people along. It's actually a very advanced leadership skill. The atmosphere has changed, and as a result, the energy has changed. If you go into a bright, loud room, humans are in more of a sympathetic state, so we are louder and we tend to be noisier versus the quiet, calm reality of a robot-assisted room. The actual surgeon's location has changed. The fidelity for the surgeon and the team has gone from tactile and close in to virtual and geographic separation, which also kinesthetically requires different training. The team is oriented in a different way. Their view is different, so they have to communicate better, and that communication is moved from open and chaotic again to closed and controlled. Right? So this is what I have seen again and again. We work with a lot of hospitals that are doing robot-assisted surgery. They always blame the technology. I recognize Da Vinci technology or whatever robot you use is not maybe as precise as teams would like. However, the failure is usually not technology. The failure is that people take the model of the left and try to put it in the realities of the right side of the screen. And it never works because technology has changed the way that we need to train and operate. So where I want to land here is just a quick map for thinking about this. And it really, for me, and I know you all know this, simulation is not about technology. It's about doubling down on the human system and how the human trains. And so the three realities that I think I've seen in my time that I've been privileged to work again in the White House, the Pentagon, and the military working with sport, there are three subtexts here that I think if we don't have a strong philosophy about how we're training and why we're doing simulation, it's really hard to think about what we're going to do. Now, I don't want to derail us because this stuff can feel overly academic, but it is important to understand the role of accelerating technology. This is a gentleman named Gordon Moore. I love to ask people if they've ever seen this. You know, most people have heard of the name, but don't know who he is. Old computer scientists, obviously the founder of Intel, the Pentium processor company. But if there's any computer scientists in the audience, Moore's Law. In Moore's Law, what Gordon Moore discovered in the 1960s is that roughly every 2 years, the capacity and speed of technology doubles. And the way that manifests is that the amount of computing power we can get on a computer chip is twice as much because we are getting smaller, more high impact, high density CPUs. We are getting more in the same amount of space. Something that doubles every 2 years is on an exponential growth curve. That for us as humans, it's really hard to conceptualize something that is nonlinear. We age in a linear fashion. We move through life in a linear way. So Moore's Law in accelerating technology is the subtext of everything we're trying to do in simulation. And what that causes for us is this stress to say, well, damn, we just made an investment in this virtual reality platform, but now there's an augmented reality platform that's cheaper and better. Should we do that? And we're in this constant state of trying to keep up with technology. Understanding that is really important. The second is complexity. One of my favorite articles is on this idea that for much of human advancement, especially for those of us in healthcare and medicine, human knowledge, from when we started the Enlightenment, there was this idea of wanting to understand why is the sky blue? What makes grass grow? What is the composition, the molecular composition of water? And so for millennia, humans were answering those questions and putting them into clean categories of medicine versus biology versus physics. And then when the computer came to be, we moved from the age of the Enlightenment to the age of the entanglement. Suddenly, computational capacity gives us an ability to move across domains of human knowledge in ways we can't keep up with. And so what that feels like for most of us is the world has gotten radically complex. We start talking about simulation, it's really hard to understand where we focus. But where that lands us, and my deep belief, is that we have to double down on the human system when we're talking about training. This gentleman is Kai-Fu Lee. He's one of the global leaders in artificial intelligence. He set up Microsoft's AI platform. He's done, I mean, if anyone's interested, he's written several books. He's an amazing thinker in the space of AI. But where I want to land us today is what Kai-Fu Lee talks about in the future of humans and AI. And we can use AI as an analog for technology in medicine. And if you can see this graph, hopefully you get enough clarity, but on the y-axis at the top is compassion, and the bottom is, let's call it, a lack of compassion, or just, no need for EQ. On the x-axis on the far left, we have things that can be optimized or are rote, and on the right require creativity or some strategic capacity. And what Kai-Fu Lee argues is that AI is going to serve that bottom left quadrant all day, right? Things that are rote and don't need compassion. But in medicine, when we need a high degree of compassion for our patients and creativity or strategy, which really comes down to many operations, trauma, many of these things that require thinking on the fly, that is a human system. And what we need to do is train humans in the ability to optimize for compassion and creativity in order to be most effective in that upper right quadrant. And so the question you're all asking is, okay, well, this is great, Brian. We've talked about all these other domains, and we've talked about accelerating technology and complexity and this idea of amplifying the human. What does that really mean for me if I'm building out a training program or trying to think about the future of simulation? The provocative sort of thought I'd like to give all of you is that 10 years from now, the top medical teams and institutions in the world will do three things. They'll get beyond endurance to obsess about the basics of human performance. I'll talk about what that is in a minute. Viewing clinician performance as the foundation for patient quality and safety. The thing I often say provocatively is the least important part of patient safety is the patient. Until we learn to train the individual provider to understand how to manage pressure and stress, not just in an operating room or in a trauma bay, but over the long arc of a career, we can never get world-class quality and safety. And then the last element is that technology and simulation are best used when they're amplifying human factors and reducing cognitive load. So let's hit this first one. I'm going to do these in like 5 minutes so that we have time for Q&A, and these are thoughts we can come back to. Getting beyond endurance. So investing in low-cost foundations for performance. I think a lot of times in simulation, I saw this in the military, we get excited by technological advancement and we go for these high-cost investments. But when we think about these kind of concepts, endure, right? Like, this is the reality of our landscape. This is not an issue technology is going to solve. This is a human issue. We saw this play out in the military. I lived this, and I saw how it can change. Most of us live our lives as service archetypes, bringing it full circle in an endurance paradigm, where the question is, how long can I go before I lose passion, before I lose my focus? We have a series of stressors, whether that's over a day, a week, over COVID, or the long arc of a career. And without the right tools, we don't adapt, and we lose our energy and we lose our passion. And one of the things that's really important, where I started on the bottom left photo, is the price of service. That inspired soul is powerful and rare, and it is indeed sacred. But if we don't, again, protect it, what we see is this concept of allostatic load. We call it the wear and tear on the body and mind. Bruce McEwen coined this term in the 90s. It's a fairly new term around stress, but it's particularly relevant for service archetypes like all of you in the audience. At a basic level, when we come into our craft in healthcare, we had a set point for homeostasis. We then went through PA school or med school or nursing school, and then we got into our career. And we had a series of stressors, and maybe we grabbed some time on the weekend to rest or a vacation once a year, but we never quite got back to homeostasis. Our heart rate slowly elevated, our sleep architecture suffered. And at the end of our career, whether that was 2 years or 10 or 30, the delta in our new set point physiologically and psychologically, that difference is what we call allostatic load. The good news is that we know, and it's been proven, that we can affect allostatic load with the right tools. It's about teaching a human how to manage the nervous system, fight or flight. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's written a great book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. The basic premise is if a zebra is going to outrun a lion and survive an attack, it moves into fight or flight sympathetic state. It defecates most of its body fluids, its heart rate and respiratory rate elevate, its hormone landscape changes, and then it goes back through a process of homeostatic reset. Humans are the same, but most of us, instead of being chased by lions, it's our caseload. It's emails, it's accelerating technology, family, life. And so we get stuck in sympathetic state, and we never learn how to push the brake and move into parasympathetic. And so if we're going to be in a performance paradigm or we're training people, we have to figure out what tools they can use to manage those stressors in order, in the long arc of a career, to not ask the question, how long can I go, but how good can I get? We still have stress. We still suffer energy depletions, but we know how to grow from that and adapt. And that's incredibly powerful. What's exciting is it's very basic. The work we do at Arena and the research we're doing is around concepts like light exposure, interaction with sun, interaction with artificial light. How do I recover using my breath? How do I think about movement to accelerate my energy or to deactivate and relax at night? And then how do I use things like gratitude in my internal dialogue to advance my own health? Second concept, when I think about simulation that I get passionate about, is again, thinking about the clinician at the center of patient quality and safety. We covered this early in the fact that all of these other fields are thinking about data and managing stress and recovering, and that there's a real lack on the front lines of medicine. But one of the things that changed my life is that when I went through SEAL training, I had to wear a sensor. And that sensor taught me the role of a high stress day or training event or a long week in the field or a deployment and how it affected my heart rate, my sleep. But it empowered me with knowledge to know what I needed in order to recover. And for me, when I'm on the water, my heart rate drops 3 to 5 beats per minute. My heart rate variability goes up 15 to 20 milliseconds. And if I can get time, I live in Nashville, Tennessee now, but if I can get time in the water on a stand-up paddle any weekend, it's massively empowering for me in my own recovery. Now, those kind of tools are at the center of what really allows someone to be at their best. Dr. Kirk Parsley taught me this. This is some of the research that I think is fascinating, this concept of operator syndrome. But what we know is that without the right tools, this is not necessarily about advanced simulation, but without the right tools, there's that allostatic load builds up over time. He had been a Navy SEAL, went to medical school and came back. And so when I was going through training, the reason I had to wear a chest strap was because Dr. Parsley was doing this research. And what he found is this concept of operator syndrome, which may be understood as the natural consequences of an extraordinarily high allostatic load, that concept we covered earlier, the accumulation of physiological, neural, and neuroendocrine responses resulting from the prolonged chronic stress and physical demands of a career with military special forces. And some of you are going to say, Brian, we're not military special forces. No, but you do work in the front lines of medicine, and it turns out it's the same. And without the right tools, what we see is this cascade below that ultimately ends up in familial and relational challenges. And so what we know is if we don't give people these right tools to self-regulate, these are not expensive, they're not technologically advanced, there's no way that culture can thrive at scale. I'm going to skip some of the biometric data we collect, but when you put sensors on people and you train them to simulate high stress and they learn what that means, they can start to control how they rest and recover and respond to stress. Interestingly, one of the things we see when people wear sensors is that when clinicians are in the hospital 4 days in a row, we believe or posit, this is some of the research I'm doing right now at the Hospital for Special Surgery. On that 4th day, there's a sympathetic saturation, and those people can't fall asleep because they've got so much data moving in their head. Their sleep suffers, and the next day they're less recovered. And so the question is, what do we do in days 1 to 3 to mitigate that impact at day 4? And then where I'll land here is that ultimately technology and simulation is about amplifying training to free up cognitive load. The challenge all of you have and you live every day is that if you were doing simulation training in the military and the left side of the screen in the creative arts or in sport, most of those disciplines spend the vast majority of their time training. Once you finish medical school or nursing school or PA school, you spend the vast majority of your time in execution, doing, in procedures or in a clinical space, very little time training. And so we have to be creative in how we think about delivering those tools, which ultimately comes down in the way that we do that is virtually by a phone. I'm going to skip this part and end here. The future training, I really believe, is not about simulation in terms of the technology. It's not about technological advancement, but about delivering basic human tools to advance the human narrative. Again, I am deeply apologetic and grateful for the pivot this morning on timeline. I hope I've challenged you in some way. I'd love to take some questions. Anyone wants to follow up or be provocative in questions back to me, there's a UPC code or a QR code here that'll get you contact info, but far more interested this morning in having taking some questions or any follow-up.
Questions, anyone? Somebody has to have a question.
Is this being used in any other nation they've implemented these concepts, or any medical school here in the United States?
Yeah, so we are working, I believe the first part that you said nation, and we are working in Canada. We have had interest in France and with some Western European countries. We have, and actually we just had a request from the Emirates and Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but we right now are in the US and Canada in terms of our work. Now, I will tell you, in the space of simulation, Canada and Britain, for some reason, are way ahead of the curve in thinking about human factors in medicine. I don't actually culturally know why that is, but it's always fascinated me. Most of the research and papers that were done prior to 2015 were abroad. Dr. Tate Shanafelt at Stanford has done a little bit more around this, but he's focused more on the end state of burnout. The second part of that question was, what was the second part? It was nations, and I just forgot. What was the second part of that, ma'am?
That's okay. Medical schools.
Oh,
And then I
yeah,
have
this is
another
a really
question.
important point. I'm sorry. I just want to hit medical schools because I think for those of you who are in medical schools, I would argue that these kind of tools and training and any simulation is best the earlier the better. And we had a conversation with the dean of a major medical school about 2 years ago. And the dean said to me, "We don't need this because our students aren't stressed." Now, my reaction to that is I radically disagree. Stress is always relative. Students feel stress in the same way a 20-year attending does. It's just over different things. The other question is like, do you want to teach someone to manage stress in combat, or do you want to teach them before they go? And so I am, Dr. Vinay Nadkarni, who may be in the audience today, has been an amazing partner of ours and is very passionate about doing this stuff earlier. I think the earlier you can get into this type of training, the better. So sorry to interrupt you. There was, I think, another question.
So one way into innovation implementation is to go to the departments of professional mental health in the medical and nursing schools, the big ones.
Yep.
Department of Mental, the professional mental health people would buy into this right away for the younger new medical students.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll tell you one of the things, and this is, I think, in simulation in general, one of the things we've learned is that semantics really matter. And here's what I mean by that. Very similar to PTSD in the military. If you say to me, "Brian, you're broken," or "you will be broken," it's human nature to move away from that narrative. So one of the reasons when we look at data on a lot of mental health platforms, there's a major saturation of mental health solutions and training. Of course, it's important and it is paramount. We see a lot of people move away from that because of the stigma. Now, we are working with Dr. Corey Feist and the Lorna Breen Foundation on this. But I will tell you, we deliberately say we are not a mental health platform. And we, in particular at Arena, we talk about the aspirational narrative of human flourishing and performance. It ends up being the same tools, but whether it's in simulation or training, particularly just the archetype of medicine, when you say that this is about being better or about flourishing in your clinical role or at home, we see a higher propensity to use that. And so mental health has been a challenging entry point for us, but I think it's a great point.
Hi, I thought it was interesting the parallel you drew about moving towards robotic surgery when you were talking about the robotic surgery and the shift about leadership and moving towards collaborative leadership. I'm wondering if you have any best advice for how to think about helping us move towards any training or building curriculum towards building collaborative leadership, because it's not as easy as it sounds.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's actually really hard. And to be, I hope I didn't make it sound easy, because it's actually something I lived in the military where that evolution from that first drone, that meant we had to reimagine how we trained leaders, how we communicated. It took years, if not decades. I do think early on for any leader in medical school or in any part of school, one of the things we advocate is earlier on thinking about being a leader, because a lot of times one of the challenges that we see, and understandably medicine has so much technical skill to acquire, people don't think about leaders until they're leaders. And so they become a chair, or they get in this role. And I'm a big advocate of thinking about leadership training earlier. The second, I think that this is in simulation, this is very low cost, but putting people in leadership positions and complex problems and having them talk through scenarios. One of the things that was fascinating to me when I first heard Dr. Balke on a Bluetooth headset, he had learned the intonation required. Like in that hierarchical environment, being a leader can be very much directive. Do this, do that. In the robotic space, one has to lead as a teammate and almost talk people along. And if you push too hard, especially because it's pioneering technology, you get pushback. My personal vantage point in the spirit of this meeting today is that can be very low cost simulation. I think leadership, though, has to be experiential, moving people through scenarios that can be, I'm in a conference room right now, simulating, this is the team, here's what's happening, go. And having people talk through what they would do is really powerful in giving feedback. But I do think that understanding or mapping out the attributes that are effective in a non-robotic space versus robotic, and then starting to teach people how to be aware of those attributes, non-directive, more collaborative, having to give up some control. And that gets into a psychometric evaluation and training, which again is generally missing. So I would think a lot of fairly low cost entry points have a real high degree of return on that. I'm curious, is anyone doing anything in this audience around training differently for robotic or what I will call minimally invasive procedures, given that tends to be a pretty, it's proliferating in just about every service line?
That would be a big fat no.
Yeah. And I will say, if there was one thing I would take away that, again, we've learned this humbly. I don't want to sound like an expert. This is what we saw happen in the military, in sport. And in sports, people have to do this because it's more about the money and winning. In the military, it is very similar about how do we use technology to amplify teams to save lives and be more effective. If there's nothing else you take away, I would say in simulation, how is simulation forcing an illumination of the different attributes required of a team? Because it's not just the leader, those team members themselves have to have different attributes. And if training and simulation and hiring don't take into account that evolution, that is where I see the biggest friction point and where I saw it in the military.
My name's Mick. I have a question. I would like to. I'm ex-military as well, and in the military there's such a mission buy-in, and I find that sometimes it's hard to recreate that mission buy-in. And if you have some teammates who are not on point with what the mission is, it gets to be a struggle. And I'm trying to figure out how I can create that, and what can I do, and how can I pragmatically do things. I'm hearing what you're saying, but I have no idea how to implement any of it. So I'm trying to think in my mind, where can I get this kind of system or training or whatever, because I think it's very helpful. But also in the military, they throw money at you like crazy, and you're involved in all sorts of training. But in the private sector, they'll have 10,000 things on holistic whatever, but you can never attend anything because you're too busy.
Yep.
So that's they don't really build it into the system. They build burnout into the system.
Totally. So
I'm trying to figure out how to make this a reality versus a fantasy.
Yep.
And those are my thoughts. And I'm on board. I'm not trying to be, but I'm trying to figure out how to do this,
Yeah, Nick, I appreciate it. And here's what I'll say to everyone. A couple quick thoughts on that. Number one, I radically push back on the idea that healthcare doesn't have the same mission as the military. I would actually argue that no group of people has been more central in stewarding a mission and purpose in American society in the last 5 years in the military. And I often say there is a bit of fatigue in the U.S. military. I'm very careful about over leveraging the military narrative. We had 20 years of war. It took a toll. It was expensive. It cost a lot. Yes, at the end of the day, men and women signed up because they deeply believed in being of service to the nation. However, I think we overlook what service means in American society. And we overlook teachers and we overlook EMTs, but especially the front lines of healthcare. And COVID changed that narrative. Now, I recognize that with COVID came immense fatigue. But one of the often very basic predicates that I don't see in healthcare is reminding people that what they do is important and central and meaningful. And I think, Nick, that, I often see people, these exercises and obligations is what I call them, the timeout before a case. the couple of minutes before someone scrubs out, those are moments to just remind the team of their mission. And I often see those squandered instead of saying, like, how do we take a minute to pledge excellence and think about what we're doing as a sacred responsibility? People are understandably trying to move through the operational tempo of the day. What's interesting when you look at these other verticals I've talked about, elite sport, there's locker rooms. In the creative arts, there's green rooms. In the military, there's team rooms. Medicine, you have break rooms, but you all know there tend to be an afterthought, and they're not places of respite and recovery and preparation. And so that becomes your huddles. It becomes the on the fly kind of swarms that you create, during a code or after a code. And I think powerful leaders in those moments remind people in very subtle, simple ways of the sacred responsibility and service they are of to society. That can sound trite and corny. One of my favorite leaders is a gentleman, Dr. Greg Argyros. He was the chief medical officer at MedStar Washington Hospital, level 1 trauma center in DC. Every single time Greg gets up in front of a team, he talks about being one team, the mission they have, and he just constantly reminds people, and you see that cultural difference. The last thing I will say is yes, the military has a lot of money and did, and I was part of that in terms of simulation and training. The most powerful training that I ever did was going on a whiteboard in a classroom and had a leader draw up on the board a combat scenario. I had to go outside and run up and down the stairs to get my heart rate up and then come into the room and look at the board. And he said, go, what would you do here? My heart rate was elevated. I was looking at a very simple chalkboard with a drawing on it, and I had to talk through what I would do. I think a lot of times simulation in training the human system, we get lost. We lose the forest through the trees because of technology. And I think it can be very low cost and creative, especially when it's grounded in mission and purpose.
Any more questions? We probably have time for one more question. Any burning question? You got one? Oh, two. Better be quick.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, do you want
to? Okay.
I guess I get it. Good morning. Thank you. I had a question just sort of following the last one, I think, in integrating some of these changes into the healthcare system. You talked a lot about the amount of time spent training and especially debriefing in the military. And, I think in healthcare, we tend to focus on after action review when we have a poor outcome, but we miss opportunities to continually improve when the patient didn't die, when we didn't have a post-surgical infection or error. And can you talk a little bit about your experiences just trying to integrate a culture of self-improvement and constant analysis and constructive feedback?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate it. I will say that one of the first things when I was at the Cleveland Clinic for the first time, this is, now 8 years ago, what really surprised me was that there was not a closed loop learning mechanism, to your point, about how do we get better. Now, to be clear, I've come to understand that medicine's landscape is fundamentally different. The realities of the OR, the ICU, trauma, even people who are in clinic, like moving patients through on 15-minute time intervals, it's really challenging to say, how do we close the learning loop? What we know about the neuroscience of learning and about people reconstructing events in order to improve is that it requires some sort of shared narrative. We have a partnership with the Mission Critical Teams Institute, which is actually out of the Wharton School of Business, that looks at how do we apply these modalities of hot washes or AARs, after action reviews. As anyone here who's worked in the military knows, there's an obsessive, uncompromising commitment. No matter what we do, we're going to close the learning loop. Personally, I think the best leaders and just teammates I've been around in medicine figure out how to be creative. One of the things that I always say, at these institutions that are really high volume, it's great that you can tell me you're doing 5,000, procedures a year, but if you're not closing the learning loop, that's 5,000 missed opportunities to get incrementally better. I am a big advocate of teaching people, again, before someone scrubs out, how do we just go around the room and say, what did we do well today? What could we improve? I think that oftentimes people get obsessed with trying to do really heavy debriefings, and where that lands is morbidity and mortality. I will tell you, I say this very humbly, but M&M is one of the least effective forums I've ever been in. Most of the time people aren't paying attention. The event happened far beyond a human's recall ability to be effective. And the person delivering that case is not often the one who is centrally involved. So I think that creating these, in flipping that on its head and saying, how do we take 2 minutes at the end of every case to just quickly learn? What I generally find, and it's not about critique, but about contributing to the team's betterment, when you culturally get that in place, people find it refreshing because it gives them an opportunity to speak up in a subtle way that starts to build trust. And when you build trust and people feel like they can contribute and be positively critical, that's how you shift culture into learning. And this idea of a learning culture versus one where people are just afraid to make a mistake, two fundamentally different approaches.
Okay, that's our last question. Thank you very much for
Thank you
your
all.
speech.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And I sorry is inadequate here, but I just want to say thank you for your patience, and I feel really humbled to get to share some thoughts with you. So I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
You as well. Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, everybody can move to your first workshop session. If you have any questions on the rooms, we do have other people from the college that can help